Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and this is RegWatch by RegulatorWatch.com. Turbulence caused by the federal government's new excise tax on nicotine vaping products continues to take a heavy toll on the Canadian vaping industry. RegWatch reported last week that the October 1st deadline for the new tax created enormous challenges for the industry as it worked to implement a hastily derived framework while navigating poor planning and government delays. Joining us today to discuss the details of the new excise tax and what the impact might be on the industry and for Canadian consumers is Ian Irvine, Professor of Economics at the Department of Economics at Concordia University in Montreal. Ian, thanks for joining us again on RegWatch.
Good to be with you again, Brent.
So Ian, the last time we had you on the show was this past February. We only had a sketch of the new tax based on the federal government's proposal in 2021. Please walk our viewers through the basics of the tax as passed into law and implemented, and were there any changes from when we last spoke?
Well, when the initial proposals came out, the Department of Finance was somewhat uncertain as to how exactly the tax would be implemented. This is an excise tax, and so it's a tax that is levied on the volume of product subject to tax. So here it's going to be a tax that is levied per milliliter of e-juice or e-liquid. So specifically what's going to happen, or what has happened, I should say, is that if you buy e-liquid in very small amounts, for example, in a closed pod, the excise tax on an amount up to 2 milliliters will be $1. If you buy amounts beyond that, up to 10 milliliters, the tax rises by $1 for every 2 milliliters. So a 10 milliliter purchase would be subject to a $5 excise tax. Beyond that, the tax is going to go in 10 milliliter increments. So if you were to purchase 20 milliliters, you would pay $6 in excise tax. If you were to buy 30 milliliters, you would pay $7. So 30 milliliters is a standard size for e-liquid sales. So $7 will be a standard excise levy on that size of container. If you go to a 60 milliliter container, the tax will go up by another $3 up to $10. And if you go up to a very large size, the largest one that's available on the market, 120 milliliters, the tax will go up by a further $6, so up to $16 on that size of the container.
What's been implemented shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone.
We knew that there was going to be an excise tax imposed, and it was really just a question of how high it would be and exactly what form it would take. So what we got confirmed in the spring budget this year was what the levy would be, $1 per 2 milliliters, and then beyond 10 milliliters, $1 per 10 milliliters. So that was the news, or the confirmation, I should say, in the spring budget of this year.
Ian, are there any inequities in the tax between the different products? You've got the closed pod systems, you've got the open e-liquid systems. Is it fairly applied?
Most e-liquid is consumed as a result of purchases in a vape shop, and then people drip that liquid into their own device at home. So that's the most common way of vaping e-liquid. Individuals can also buy pre-filled pods at a vape shop. They can buy disposables at a vape shop, which contain a certain amount of e-liquid, or they can go to a gas and convenience store and buy a Juul or a Vuse type device. If you go to a vape shop, you're more likely to buy a 30 milliliter container or a 60 milliliter container, whereas if you go to a gas and convenience store, the corner store, or a dépanneur, as we call them in Quebec, you're more likely to buy a pair of pre-filled pods for either a Vuse or a Juul device. And those pods will contain somewhere between 0.7 and 2 milliliters of e-juice. So we buy the stuff in very different forms, and that's because people have different tastes, and some people like the convenience of a corner store, and some people are just happy to drip their bottle of e-juice into their own device, and then they replace the coils of the pods for their own device periodically. So it's the diversity in the way in which we consume the product that makes it challenging to structure a tax that everybody would call equitable or uniform or whatever word you want to choose.
It would appear to me that this tax, as implemented, will cause quite a bit of disruption for those different kinds of tastes that you would have and where you might like to go to make your purchases. That could all unwind for some people, couldn't it?
Yeah, well, it's going to be difficult to predict exactly how people are going to react. It's between the different forms in which we can consume e-juice. A bottle of e-juice that has 30 milliliters in it is now going to carry a $7 federal excise tax on it. And then if we have a sales tax on top of that, then 15% on top of the price will bring a manufacturer's suggested retail price of $20 up to about $31. So the federal excise tax and the sales tax together will generate about $11 in revenue relative to a $20 retail price. So that's a tax rate over the retail price of more than 50%. So it's relatively high there.
And that was going to be my next question, is whether or not you feel that this tax is a modest tax.
A modest tax? Oh, gee. In this particular instance where you get an $11 tax over a $20 base price, we can hardly call that a modest tax. I think it's a relatively high tax on a product which is not risk-free, but on a product which is low risk. We really do want to try and keep in mind that there are high risk and low risk nicotine products. And in dealing with vaping, we are dealing with a lower risk product. And so we should be guided by the fact that there are lower risks here in choosing the tax revenue, or choosing the tax rate or the excise levy rate that we impose on it. So this is not a low tax rate, no.
This is a harm reduction product when excise taxes are generally applied to products that are considered to be sinful, the sin tax. So is this the right taxing tool to apply to this product category?
Oh, well, you've opened a very big question there, Brent. If you read a recent report by the Royal College of Physicians in England, they recommended about a 5% tax on vaping products in order to induce smokers to move into it and to signal to consumers that this is a lower risk, much lower risk product than cigarettes. So if we were to take that recommendation, and it does come from a very august body, the Royal College of Physicians, if we take that recommendation and put it in the context of our existing sales taxes, we might go from, the combined federal and provincial rate of, say, 13, 14, 15%, add another 5% to that, and you'd get a 20% rate. So you would have a 20% tax on vaping products then, rather than something much higher, 40 or 50%. So that's just to take one example of what is out there as a recommendation by a very responsible medical body.
Let me ask you this, just turning back here to Canada and the implementation. As I mentioned, there's been quite a few challenges going on with the industry in terms of the implementation of this tax. There was only just a hair over 90 days from the moment that the budget received royal assent and from when this excise tax was to be implemented or has been implemented. So there's been problems with tax license delays, excise tax stamp scarcity, lack of sufferance warehousing, and mixed inventories to market, where some of the inventory is going to be highly taxed and some of it not highly taxed. And that could be for several months now, certainly going into the Christmas holiday period. Are these types of challenges normal for an excise tax rollout?
Oh, really, I'm not sufficiently expert on that. You sound more informed on it than I am, Brent, and I'm sure people in one of the two vaping associations that would be better than I am at informing you on that. But I will say something about the economics of it once we get through all of these setup difficulties. The fact that we have an excise tax in place will add to the cost of production for producers. They will have to buy a stamp for each product that they sell. They will have to buy some machinery to put the stamps on. They will have to have essentially a bonded warehouse. They will have new accounting standards to meet. They will have the costs of keeping track of the amount of revenue that they owe to Ottawa, and then they will have to keep 6 years worth of records. So there will be substantial costs associated with the implementation of this excise tax. And so if I were to guess, I would imagine that the ultimate price of products may go up by more than the amount of the levy per se. So if we take that 30 milliliter bottle that has a manufacturer's suggested retail price of $20, that price may go up by more than the $7, which would be suggested just by the rate itself because of the additional costs imposed on manufacturers. This is a competitive industry, and they're not monopolists or oligopolists. They're competitors, and margins are tight. And so it'll be very difficult for this industry to absorb additional costs, and it's more likely that there will be some pass on of those costs to the consumer at the end of the day.
Now, let's jump into the numbers. You wrote a detailed report on behalf of the industry, providing an estimate of initial revenues from the tax to government and a breakdown of the consequences it might entail. So let's first start with the revenue. How much will this new tax generate in revenue in its first year for the government?
Well, you're absolutely right in saying that I was asked to do this report, and I should disclose that I have been under contract to the Canadian Vaping Association. They asked me if I would be able to do an estimate of how much revenue would be generated. They asked me because I have a good deal of experience in doing these kinds of models. I've done these models for the cigarette industry and also for the cannabis industry. So it's not a big step then to develop this modeling for the vaping industry. So they asked me to do that, and the Department of Finance put out an estimate of $145 million in revenue when they presented their budget in the spring of this year. And the Vaping Association wanted to know from me if I thought that that would be a reasonable number. So what I tried to do was to get information on the quantity of different products sold in the industry as a whole. And then I tried to determine how much liquid was in each of those products. And then I applied the excise duty schedule to those volumes. So I made an estimate of how many pods are sold in gas and convenience stores each year, how many disposables are sold, how many bottles of different sizes are sold, how many pre-filled pods are sold in vape shops. And I did get information from the Canadian Vaping Association on these amounts, and they were able to supply those estimates as a result of having done a survey of their members. So I fed that all into what we call an economic model of the tax sector, and I came up with some numbers at the end of the day. And the numbers that I have come up with are a lot greater than the $145 million estimate that the Department of Finance made public in its spring budget. One of the key elements in building a model like this is to try to figure out by how much consumers will cut back when the price goes up. We all know about supply and demand. If the good is more expensive, people buy less of it. And what I tried to do in the model was to experiment under different assumptions about the degree to which people would cut back their expenditures and to see how that would impact the tax revenue that would be generated. But no matter what I did in the model, it always came out to be the case that much more revenue, approximately twice the amount of revenue, twice the $145 million revenue, was the number I kept coming up with some variations on it, depending upon how I assumed consumer responses would vary in response to higher prices. If the objective of the Department of Finance was to generate a revenue of 145 million, and my estimates indicate that they'll be getting 250 or 300 million out of the actual tax that has been imposed, then obviously they could have imposed a lower tax rate, and they would have been able to get their $145 million from that. They didn't need to impose this high tax.
I mean, that's really undershooting the mark, isn't it?
I think so, yeah. And I would emphasize that there are always uncertainties when you build these models, and so what you have to try to do is to say, well, let's consider a reasonable range of possibilities here in consumer responses. Are consumers going to cut back a lot? Or are they going to cut back a little in response to the higher prices? And that was what I tried to do in the modeling exercise. But no matter whether I assumed that they would cut back by a very small amount or by a substantial amount, the tax revenue figures that were coming in at the end of the day were much, much higher under any scenario almost than the number that was published by finance.
Let's just set that part to the side for a moment, because there's the other number that's of great concern too as well. So you've got a huge amount of revenue being generated from the tax, and then you've also got a commensurate fall in revenue for the vendors. And correct me if I'm wrong, but in one of your base estimations that it would be $365 million revenue loss for vendors this year.
In putting in modeling these different scenarios, I tried to be guided by what's out there in the research literature. And sure enough, accompanying the fact that more tax revenue would be generated than was envisaged in the budget, if it's the case that consumers are going to respond by cutting back their purchases, then sure enough, there will be a reduction in revenue accruing to the vendors, the industry, the producers, and so forth. There'll be a pretty high tax revenue, and there will be a cutback in sales in vape shops and gas and convenience stores. What people are going to do as a result of not spending money in vape shops and gas and convenience stores, if it is the case that they respond reasonably strongly to the higher prices, is difficult to say. We don't know if some will go to, or we don't know how many buyers will go to the illegal market. We don't know if people will go back to cigarettes. If you're concerned about public health, then you would hope that would not happen. But we're in fairly new territory here, and we're not really quite sure how people will respond by in possibly going into other markets or looking for other sources for their nicotine.
Well, and that begs the question on how many vapers do you think, or do we know, who might go back to smoking?
Well, again, there are some estimates in the statistical and econometric literature, and most of the estimates, not every one of them, but most of the estimates indicate, and a lot of the data is for the United States, most of the estimates indicate that cigarettes and e-liquid, cigarettes and vaping are substitute goods rather than complementary goods. Complementary goods are goods that go together. Substitute goods are goods that people substitute one for the other when the price of one of them goes up. So the statistical literature, by and large, comes up with the finding that these are substitute goods. So again, we can't be certain to what degree people will go back to cigarettes, but I think it's also possible that if you make these products, these new low-risk products, too expensive, there is less of an incentive for people who are smoking to move to the lower risk product. So it's not just the case that people might say, oh, I'm going to go back to cigarettes. I think, relatively few people might do that if they are committed vapers, because they will have come to realize that vaping is not nearly as bad for their health as smoking is. But it may be the case that it's more likely the case that people who are smoking will be less inclined to move over to the lower risk product because they haven't experienced the better health that is associated with the lower risk products in cigarettes. So in that way, cigarettes and vaping are substitutes because you would get more switch over if the price were lower.
Now, from an economics point of view, and also, marketing and so forth, there's a signal that's being sent to smokers. Let's just, focus on current smokers right now. There's a signal being sent to the smoker from the government through this tax, whether they like it or not. What do you think that signal is?
Well, it's not a terribly positive signal. I would, if and I'm not speaking for anybody other than myself here when I say what I'm going to say now. I think that if you were to take the proposal of the Royal College of Physicians in England and say, well, let's just put a retail tax of an extra X% onto the good, then much as British Columbia did a couple of years ago in one of their budgets, they just put a 20% tax on vaping in place of their provincial tax. So what I would like to see myself personally as a researcher, not as a spokesperson for the vaping associations, I think we might be able to just get away with instead of having a 15% combined federal and provincial sales tax, just have a 20% tax on. I mean, we really have to think here. Why is it that we want to impose a heavy tax on vaping? Vaping is different from alcohol. Alcohol has external effects in society. Young people drink cheap alcohol, or people of any age can drink cheap alcohol and get involved in accidents, and there can be a loss of life. A lot of people die from cirrhosis of the liver or other complications resulting from excessive use of alcohol. But in the case of vaping, the external effects that users have on other people are much, much smaller than they are for alcohol. And so we shouldn't be guided by the taxes that we put on alcohol. We should see vaping as a less risky product than alcohol and tax correspondingly.
Now, you mentioned British Columbia, the province of British Columbia's 20% tax. Let me ask you this, and we haven't yet talked about it here, but the big fear of everyone involved is that the provinces that who wish to jump in and join the federal government on this excise tax. Explain what that is all about and the possibilities of that happening.
Well, I think this constitutes an enormous fear in the vaping industry, and I think with justification, because if it is the case that the provinces get very zealous in attacking vaping, and they decide that because nicotine or tobacco-based products form a joint jurisdiction for both the provinces and the federal government, and they decide to get in on the act and say, well, if the federal government put this tax on, we can do the same thing and we can share in the spoils. So, for example, if you look at taxes on cigarettes at the present time, the federal tax is about 15 cents per stick. But many provinces have a provincial excise levy of about 30 cents per stick. So it's quite likely that the provinces could say, look, in the field of cigarettes, we get an excise revenue that is twice as large as the federal excise levy. Surely we're entitled to the same thing in the field of vaping. Now, if that happened, then there would be potentially colossal effects in the industry, much bigger than the ones that I have tried to document in the modeling exercise that I engaged in on behalf of the Canadian Vaping Association.
Now, in that model, you did scratch some numbers, or more than scratch, it comes out of your modeling, and that if indeed the provinces do decide to jump in with the federal government on this excise tax, it could jump to an additional, to $396 million in additional revenue to the federal government.
Yeah, and once again, it depends upon how consumers respond. If consumers cut back a lot, in response to the higher tax, then not so much revenue will be generated. If they don't cut back a lot, then a lot more revenue will be generated. And so if consumers were not to cut back a lot, well, that would be better for the industry. But at the same time, it would generate tax revenues maybe 3 times greater than the amount envisaged in the budget.
And also lead to a major loss in sales for the vendors.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Again, depending upon how responsive consumers are. If they're highly responsive, then the losses to vendors will be considerable. If they're less responsive, then we would still have substantial losses, but not as much if the consumers were somewhat less responsive in cutting back to the imposition of the tax.
Don't we have the potential here of destroying this entire industry in Canada? I mean, or am I being overly excited here?
No, I think there is the precedent of what happened in Nova Scotia a couple of years ago when the Nova Scotian government came out with guns blazing against the industry, and a huge percentage of the vape shops closed down in Nova Scotia. Now, that was a one-off situation because even though there are regulations on across provincial border shopping in these products, it's still the case that individuals, when they go from Nova Scotia to New Brunswick, or when they've got friends coming in, or they can order online if the online vendor is not too concerned about shipping out of province, and they can avoid the local taxes to some degree. And so really what you do in that situation, where you've got one province putting on punitive taxes and other provinces not, all you're really doing is exporting jobs from your own province to other provinces. You close down vape shops in your own province, and then other provinces hire some more people to do the shipping for them or to do the retailing for them. But if you have a case where across the board, all of the provinces get in on the act, then it becomes more and more difficult for residents of particular provinces to evade these higher across the board taxes. And that's where you would certainly see a move to the illegal market. You would see people bringing stuff back from the United States with them, and the industry would degenerate very quickly. Italy is another case in point. I was reading the other day, the Italian government a few years ago decided to impose very heavy taxes on vaping. There were a huge number of the vape shops, more than half of them closed down. And then ex post, they realized how crazy their taxes were, and they more recently have reduced their taxes again. So it would be really nice if we didn't have to go through that learning process in Canada when there's already experience out there.
Ian, let me just say that, clearly, if you're seeing $300, $400, $500, $600 million in reduction of sales in the vaping industry, and then a couple $100 million or so actually going out to government, I mean, there really is nothing left there to support the industry. So do you see that there could be consolidation of businesses in the industry, jobs lost, and so forth?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, the industry right now, we reckon, accounts for somewhere between $1.5 and $2 billion worth of sales annually. I don't know how many people are employed in the industry, but a very large part of the industry is domestic. Pretty well all of the production of e-liquid is done domestically. A lot of the finished devices are imported, so the dual-use devices are made overseas, and most of the disposables are made overseas also. But there's a very sizable domestic component in this industry. So if there are big cutbacks as a result of a high federal rate and then a high provincial rate, then there is going to be an impact on the domestic economy. It's not just the fact that we will be importing fewer goods from China or wherever it is we're importing our disposables.
Ian, we just had Dr. Kenneth Warner on the show, eminent tobacco controller out of the University of Michigan. And also with him was Cliff Douglas, also from the University of Michigan and former vice president of tobacco control at the American Cancer Society. They were on the show talking about a range of these issues, and specifically on tax. Levying high taxes is really tobacco control 101. It's the first step that you take to really try to take out big tobacco and to make, smoking unappealing for the consumer. And then when I look at what's happening here, I can't help but not think that the government of Canada knows this, iron hard rule of economics and tobacco control, and that's tax something extremely high and people will stop using the product.
I think there are a couple of things to say there. The people you mentioned are extraordinarily well-known people, and I think it's really important to recognize that a huge number of the people who are speaking out on behalf of reduced risk products are people who have spent a large part of their lives advocating against cigarettes and advocating against combustible tobacco products. The people who are speaking out on behalf of harm reduction are not mouthpieces for the industry. In many cases, they are eminent scholars who have published hundreds of papers over their lives and have been extraordinarily worried about the impact of combustible tobacco on the health of the population. Not so long ago, a group of, I think, 13 past presidents of the Society for Research in Nicotine published an open letter, and they advocated, these are presidents of the society, and they advocated that society and government have a more open attitude to the use of reduced harm products in enabling people to transition from a high risk to a much lower risk product. So all to say is that, there are a lot of very wise people out there who are advocating for low-risk products. They recognize that, we're all human, we're all prone to want to consume certain items that may not be great for us, but nonetheless may not do us a great deal of harm at the end of the day, and we just have to be willing to tolerate that in an open society. Some people like to buy lottery tickets. Some people like to have a glass of wine with their supper. Some people like to consume cannabis in the evening after their day's work. Some people like to vape on nicotine. So we should think about nicotine in that context rather than thinking about it as a big evil in the same way as we might think about combustible tobacco. So Ken Warner and his colleague that you had on are very eminent people, and they really should be listened to. To answer the second part of your question, don't we know this in government? I would have to say yes. A lot of people in Health Canada know that what the advocates of harm reduction are saying, and they understand it. But it seems to me that there is a very strong set of traditional embedded forces that is unable to distinguish between the impacts of combustible products and non-combustible products. What are these people going to do if they adhere to the belief system which says, hey, these are low harm products, let people consume them? They won't be able to spend their days guiding us through our lives and guiding new and formulating new principles for us to live by. And so there's an entrenched culture that grew up and is based upon a distrust, reasonably so, of tobacco companies and fear of the health consequences of consuming combustible tobacco. And I think it seems to me that it's very difficult for a lot of people in Ottawa to break out of that historic culture and to try to see harm reduction for what it is. It took us a very long time as a society to buy into needle exchanges, but by and large, most of us have bought into that idea. Needle exchanges are harm reduction processes, and I think we have to try to think of vaping products as reduced harm products rather than being a product which, rather than being products which are going to cause us endless ill health, they are not in the same category as cigarettes at all. And I don't know how long more it's going to take to for Ottawa to get out of its traditional mindset that is still thinking about battles with tobacco companies.